Buenos dias, amigos. I got some time here, so I'm going to read some more stories today. And I think I got some real good ones that you may enjoy. I hope so. This one here, this first story, it's a true story, and I love those. It is called The Story of Ruby Bridges. This is an amazing little girl here. Just amazing. So here, and it's by Robert Coles and illustrated by George Ford. Just an amazing story. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylerton, Mississippi. We were poor, very, very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by, and there were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think. Making sure I'm holding that up right. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day, and after they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our church children to be near God's Spirit, Ruby's mother said. We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children, and it wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's laws. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to McDonough, not 19, and 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to 1st grade in William France Elementary School. Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. We sat there and we prayed to God, Ruby's mother said, that we'd all be strong and we'd have courage and we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl, and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the France Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in the white school. People called Ruby names. Oh, some wanted to hurt her. And the city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. And the marshals carried guns. Now, there's a part right there I think would be just absolutely terrifying and for anybody. Every day for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the France school surrounded by marshals. Wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail, Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street, men and women and children shouting at her. They pushed towards her, but the marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to that school. And when Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Miss Hurley. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, or to play with, or to learn with, or to eat lunch with. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite and she worked well at her desk, Miss Hurley said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child that I've ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom in an empty building. Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said Miss Hurley. How she went by those mobs and sat there all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Miss Hurley would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing just fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. Then one morning something happened. Miss Hurley stood by a window in her classroom as she usually did, watching Ruby walk towards the school. Suddenly Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. Miss Hurley saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. When she went into the classroom, Miss Hurley asked her what happened. Miss Hurley told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. I didn't stop and talk with them, she said. Ruby, I saw you talking, Miss Hurley said. I saw your lips moving. I wasn't talking, said Ruby. I was praying. I was praying for them. Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day before and after school. Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you. Isn't that amazing coming from this little girl? Now, this is the afterward, because that was kind of the end of the story, but here's what happened. Later that year, 2 white boys joined Ruby at the France Elementary School. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been in school and learning. The mob became very angry when the first white boys went back to school. But those boys were soon joined by other children. You know, we've been sitting back and letting our children get cheated out of an education because some people have tried to take the law into their own hands, one parent said. Yeah, it's time for us to fight for the side of the law and for our children's right to go to a school and get their education. They all did get their education. Ruby and a growing number of boys and girls who went to school with her. By the time Ruby was in the 2nd grade, the mobs had given up their struggle to scare Ruby and defeat the federal judge's orders that New Orleans schools be desegregated so that children of all races might be in the same classroom. Year after year, Ruby went to the France school. She graduated from it, then went on to graduate from high school. Ruby Bridges is married to a building contractor and has 4 sons who attend school within the New Orleans public school system. Now a successful businesswoman, she has created the Ruby Bridges Educational Foundation for the purposes of increasing parental involvement in schools. I just love that. That's just such a great story, so inspiring. And I just don't know, 6 years old and having the courage to do that. Wow. Now, here is another book I ran across. It's called Who Owns the Sun? And it's written and illustrated by Stacy Chabowski. And this is her right there. Now, I'll read you a little something about her. Why I chose this book, because the book is so great. The story in it is so great, but also is a little inspiration for you guys. Because at 14 years of age, Stacy Chbosky wrote and illustrated Who Owns the Sun? And won the 1987 National Written and Illustrated by Awards Contest for students in the 14 to 19 age category. Stacy lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with her parents, Fred and Leah, and her older brother, Stephen. Stacy is a sophomore in Upper St. Clair High School. She enjoys reading, especially novels by Stephen King and short stories by Ray Bradbury. Stacy likes to write too. She has written poetry, monologues, short stories, and plays. Stacy studies acting, voice, and dance, and she has received numerous honors at dance competitions, including several first-place awards. She hopes to have a career in musical theater as a performer, director, and writer. In her spare time, Stacy attends movies, listens to new wave music, and spends time with her friends. But this is a great story. Who Owns the Sun? This story just blew me away. It was an April afternoon, and my world, now touched by the rays of the sun, smelled sweet. The light that fell across my face felt warm and clean. Who, I asked my father, owns the sun? He pointed towards the sky and told me to look up. I raised my head and squinted my eyes against the sun's powerful glare. Only a fool believes he can own the sun, my father said. Everybody sees the sun's light, and everybody feels the sun's warmth. But the sun is too large, too great for one person to own. So it shines on all the earth and gives itself to every living thing. I thought of what my father had said, and I believed him. I watched him as he walked away from me and went back to his work in the field. That night we sat on the porch, resting after our day's work, and let the soft, sweet night sounds come to us. Somewhere buried in the deep, wet grass, a cricket cried to itself. Now and then a breeze rustled the green leaves and stirred a night lullaby. The black sky wrapped around us like a soft muffler. The peaceful stars glowed clean white and comforted me. I leaned back in my chair for a better look at them. Who, I asked my father, owns the stars? Well, the stars are too far away to be owned by anyone, my father answered quietly. No one has ever touched the stars, but everyone looks at them and everybody wonders at their beauty. The stars light the night sky and they shine for all people to see. Time passed and spring gave way to summer. The rays of the hot sun burned deep into the ground. In late July, a welcome rain fell on the earth and began to heal the scars that the sun had left behind. The thirsty ground that lay cracked in dusty spirals drank deeply and once again became a rich, dark brown. Who, I asked my father, owns the rain? No one owns the rain, my father told me as he scooped up a handful of moist dirt and he let the soil sprinkle through his fingers. The rain gives life to this earth, he said. Sometimes rain can be too strong and flood the land, my father explained. It can also be gentle and nourish seeds in the ground. But the rain cannot be owned by anyone. It gives freely of itself and falls on every land in the world. The next day, after the rain had stopped, the air again grew still and hot. It was heavy and thick, and it seemed to smother everything it touched. It pressed on my chest and made me long for a deep breath of fresh air. I stayed inside most of the day, hoping for a cool breeze. Just before dinner it came. First there was a gentle stirring of the wind, and then soft breezes blew and began to push the hot air away. I filled my lungs and let the cool air cool my whole body. It was a wonderful feeling. Who, I asked my father, owns the wind? No one, my father answered, as he turned to face the breeze. The wind is too mighty to be owned by anyone. Sometimes the wind is moody and it shows its evil temper. It swirls into a storm and crushes everything in its path. Or the wind can be funny and blow the hat off your head. Or it can turn a windmill and help a man do his work. And sometimes it can be pleasant and cool, just like it is right now. But no one owns the wind, my father answered. It roams the earth. It is a wanderer that visits everyone in every place. The next morning, I awoke to the fragrance of my mother's biscuits baking in the oven. The smell made me hungry, so I dressed quickly and joined my father at the breakfast table. From far away, I heard the clear, sweet trill of a bird's call. A second bird answered with a stream of chirps, and while we ate, the birds continued their friendly greetings. Who, I asked my father, owns the birds? Nobody can own the birds, my father answered. Everyone hears them sing their songs, and everyone watches them soar and glide across the sky. But birds can fly away at any time and go anywhere they choose. They are too free to be owned, but they share their beauty and their song with the whole world. There were wildflowers growing in the field behind our house. They brightened the summer with colorful beauty, and there were lavender ones, orange ones, yellow ones with golden edges. But my favorites were the pink ones that bloomed in the clearest, softest shade of rose that I had ever seen. The flowers appeared so peaceful and at home in their beds. Only in midsummer, when the world was overflowing with flowers, would I allow myself to pick a small bouquet from my mother's table. And when placed in a jar of water, the flowers looked so lovely, and their fragrance filled the house. Who, I asked my father, owns the flowers? Well, a man can pick any flower he chooses, my father answered, but the flowers really belong to the land. The land was here long before man, and it will be here long after he is gone. Flowers give their beauty for all people to enjoy, my father said. If we don't destroy the flowers, they will bloom and seed, and more flowers grow in their place. I did not understand all my father had said, but I accepted it. He had told me the world was full of beautiful things, things that could not be owned, but that could be loved and appreciated by everyone. I knew my father was a great man. He had a strong body and a kind heart. His huge hands were cracked and weathered by the sun and calloused from his work. And yet, when he put his hands over mine, they felt as warm and gentle as my mother's. My own hands were small and soft, making his even more fascinating to me. I hoped that one day I would have hands that were as strong and gentle as his. I was not the only one who had respect for my father. I noticed the way other men watched him as he worked. I knew how they sometimes counted on him for help. The men called my father Big Jim, which certainly described him because he was taller and stronger than any of them. When he bent over the plow and dug it into the earth, his muscles strained and pressed hard against the cloth of his shirt. My father was so tall, I had to lean my head way back to look into his eyes. But when his eyes finally met, when our eyes finally met, there was always a smile on his face, a smile just for me, his firstborn son. My mother cooked in the big house for Mr. Finley and his family. Every day about noon, I would go to the huge kitchen and breathe in the hot, steamy smell of pies and cookies baking. My mother would fill a pail with meat, beans, and biscuits, and sometimes a piece of pie for my father's lunch, and she would fill a jug with cool buttermilk. Carrying the pail and jug, I ran to my father, who was working in the field. My errand was a labor of love. I ran because I loved my father and because I knew how hungry and thirsty he would be. Across the fields I raced, never slowing my pace or stopping to look around. But one day, it was late in August as I recall, the day was so hot and the air so heavy that I slowed down and walked part of the way. As I came to the west field, I heard the sounds of men talking, and when I drew near, I recognized Mr. Finley, the owner of the big house, and saw another man who was a stranger to me. "See that big fellow over there?" I heard Mr. Finley say as he leaned against the fence. "That's Big Jim. He's a strong one, that man." I realized Mr. Finley was referring to my father, so I slowed my pace even more, and when the stranger said, "Why, just look at him lift those rocks," I could not help but feel proud. He's our best field hand, all right," Mr. Finley said. "Why, he'll have all the rocks out of that field by the end of the week." "Oh, I wished I had him working in my fields," the other man said. "Yes, Big Jim puts all the other field hands to shame," Mr. Finley agreed, lighting his cigar and blowing a puff of blue smoke into the air. "I wished I owned 10 more just like him." For a moment, I just stood there. I could not believe my ears. Mr. Finley's words echoed in my mind. I wished I owned 10 more just like him. Owned? How could that be? Oh, it couldn't be true. Suddenly, I did not want to hear more, and I didn't want to think about what I had just heard, but I couldn't help myself. I climbed over the fence and ran across the field, the lunch pail banging against my leg and buttermilk sloshed from the jug. But I didn't care. When my father saw me approaching, he stood up straight, smiled, and waved to me as he usually did. But when he saw how upset I was, the smile quickly disappeared from his face. I didn't stop running until I was standing squarely in front of him. "I just heard Mr. Finley say he owned you," I blurted out. "Is that true?" I asked. My father's face tightened with anger and pain. His hands clenched into fists. The muscles of his arms suddenly swelled, and then he turned away. "Does Mr. Finley own you?" I asked again. Finally, my father turned back to me. It was when I saw the sadness on his face that I knew the words Mr. Finley had spoken were true. "But he doesn't own the stars or the sun," I reasoned, "so how can he own you?" My father was quiet for what seemed like a long time. Finally he spoke. "A man is a beautiful thing," he said, "a very beautiful thing. But some men forget this, and sometimes they try to keep other men captive. They buy and sell people, as if human beings were no more than cattle. But only a fool believes he can really own another man, and only a fool will try," my father said. "Mr. Finley may own my body, but I have a heart, and I have a mind, and he can never own these. Inside of me, I'm too powerful to be owned by anyone. Inside, I am like the sun." I listened to the words my father spoke. I considered them carefully, trying to sort out the thoughts that raced through my mind. Finally, I settled on the one question I knew I had to ask. "Does Mr. Finley own me too?" I wanted to know. My father looked directly into my eyes for a moment, and for a moment after that. And then he bent down and he put his arms around me, and he began to cry. Can you imagine finding out that you're a slave and your families are slaves? You didn't even know it, this little boy. But anyway, here's the afterward. Here's the good part about this book. Looking back, I think my childhood was ended that summer day. Many cold winters lay ahead. In his lifetime, my father saw many changes. He lived to stand at last as a free man and to see his children attend school. One of my brothers became a musician. The other one is a Baptist minister. My sister opened a restaurant, and I became a teacher. My parents hoped and dreamed that the time would come when other people would not be judged by the color of their skins, but would be respected for the quality of their thoughts and deeds. I am sure my parents would have been pleased, though overjoyed, if they could have known that one of their great-grandchildren would one day be elected governor of our state. I did a little follow-up on that. That's that statement there. And in 1872 to 1873, a man named, this is Governor P.B.S. Pinchback. And I don't know if you can see him. That's a picture of him right there. He became governor in Louisiana. And there's more to that story, but we'll stop with that one right there. But I thought that is so cool. I just love that book. Now I got another one here. This story here is probably a fictional story, but it could be true. Because there's a teacher over the White Pines, Mr. Knight, was talking to me about this one day, and he says, you know, usually in stories like this one, there are a lot of them, there's usually a little bit of truth embedded in there somewheres. So maybe, I just hope, judge it for yourself what you think, but this one's called The Legend of Freedom Hill. And it's by Linda Jacobs Altman, and it's illustrated by Cornelius Van Wright and Ying Hua Hu. So two different people illustrated this book. But I love this story, and I just hope against hope that it was true. See that hill over yonder? Why, that's Freedom Hill. Around these parts, everyone knows how it got its name. The story's what you might call local famous. That's not to say everybody believes it. Knowing's one thing, believing's another. The whole business started with two little girls called Rosabelle and Sophie. They lived hereabouts back in the gold rush days. One was black and one was white, and the pair of them just smart as whips. I reckon they got friendly because they were both outsiders. Rosabelle on account of her color, and Sophie on account of her religion. Hers was the only Jewish family in town. Now, Rosabelle had freedom papers, but her mama didn't. Miss Violet was a runaway slave. Seems some abolitionists from up north raised enough money to buy one person's freedom, and Miss Violet stayed a slave so her child could be free. Sometime later, Miss Violet took Rosabelle and she hightailed it to California, found herself a likely wagon train with folks who cared more about gold than freedom papers. Out in California, the buying and selling of human folks was purely against the law. Trouble was, they had this thing called the Fugitive Slave Act, meaning runaways who got caught would be shipped back to their owners. That's why the slave catcher came, and that's where the story of Freedom Hill truly begins. Let's see, yep. The catcher was a regular bear of a man with hard eyes and a disposition to match. He caught Miss Violet working in the boarding house kitchen, grabbed her in a tick, right in the midst of stirring up a mess of beans and greens and bacon for the boarders' supper. When Rosabelle saw the catcher take her mama, she ran straight away to Sophie's house. The family was getting ready for their Sabbath supper when she came a-knocking. Soon as Rosabelle told them what had happened, they commenced to make a fuss over her. Mr. Kagan said she should rest, and Mrs. Kagan said she should eat, and all the Kagan children scurried to make a place for her at the table. Sophie gave her a handkerchief to wipe away her tears. "We'll think of something, Rosabelle," she said. "Don't you worry." Come sundown, Mrs. Kagan lit candles and said a prayer in a language Rosabelle had never heard before. Sophie called it Hebrew. Then everyone wished everybody else a good Sabbath and got down to the business of eating. There was chicken soup with vegetables from Mrs. Kagan's garden and a loaf of braided bread called challah. The Kagans didn't exactly ask Rosabelle to stay with them. They just acted like that was how things ought to be. Come bedtime, they put her in with Sophie, and the two girls lay side by side, covers pulled up to their chins, talking a regular streak about how to save Miss Violet. The best way they could figure to help Miss Violet was to buy her freedom, and that cost a plain fortune. Only way they knew to get that kind of money was digging for gold. So that's what they took a mind to do. Folks surely did laugh when those little girls went into the hills with their pans and picks and shovels. They started out just watching prospectors at work. Next thing anybody knew, they were washing rock and soil in their pans, swirling and twirling until everything was gone but the gold. In 2 days of trying, Rosabelle and Sophie ripped their clothes, bruised their knees, and scraped their knuckles, all for less than half an ounce of gold. "Oh, this will take forever," Sophie wailed. But they didn't have forever. That slave catcher was moving through those hills, chasing after slaves the way other men chased after gold. He kept Miss Violet locked up in his old patrol wagon, and before long he nabbed a half-grown boy and then headed off chasing somebody else. Once that wagon got full, the catcher would haul everybody away, and there'd be no knowing Miss Violet's whereabouts if that happened. Mostly because nothing better came to mind, the girls went to see Mr. Tompkins at the assay office. He was the man who tested and weighed everybody's gold. Folks said he knew the hills better than any other living soul. Mr. Tompkins had a fine idea. "Why, you young'uns ought to be looking at narrow gullies and piddly squatting caves and such, places so small grown folks can't get in there, so they just pass them by." The girls thanked him kindly and went off to look for tight little places that grown-ups might have missed. They found plenty on that hill back of the assay office. Sophie shimmied into a crevice so narrow she near got wedged halfway in. Rosabelle poked into a harmless-looking cave and found herself staring into the bright glowing eyes of a fox. Rosabelle screamed and the fox barked, and both of them tore out of that cave like a passel of wildcats was clawing at their heels. Sophie fell down laughing. "Hey, it's not funny," Rosabelle said. But the next thing she knew, she was laughing to beat the band. And when she was all laughed out, she crawled into the cave again. "Sophie!" Rosabelle yelled. "I think I found gold. Come and see." So Sophie scrambled into the cave. "Yeah, sure looks like gold to me," she said. And it was gold, all right, a great gleaming chunk of it, and there was more running all through a vein of quartz rock. The girls dug up the nugget that very afternoon and took it to the assay office. Mr. Tompkins said the nugget was enough to buy Miss Violet's freedom right by itself. "Now," he said, "let's file you a claim." "What's a claim?" Rosabelle asked. "Well, it's a piece of paper says you two own yourself a gold mine. That's the way of things hereabouts. You find it, you own it." Rosabelle and Sophie jumped up and down, hugging and squealing and laughing all at the same time. By morning, the news was all over town. It spread so fast, the girls didn't have to go looking for the slave catcher. He came looking for them. And right in front of the assay office, he stopped the wagon and unlatched the door. The prisoners stumbled out, all of them wearing shackles, all of them dazed by the sunlight. Miss Violet came first, with a half-grown boy behind her, and then came a lady with one blind eye, and a man with whip scars all over his back, and a young woman near her birthing time. Aside from being a mite thinner, Miss Violet looked none the worse for wear. Rosabelle hugged her, and Sophie hugged her too. Oh, the three of them just bursted out crying. The slave catcher unlocked Miss Violet's shackles and ordered the others to exercise themselves. They moved in a circle around and around, leg irons clinking and clanking with every step. The girls looked at those people, and then they looked at each other. Neither of them said a word. They just knew. Rosabelle took the paper out of her pocket. "Mister," she said, "we'll give you our claim to free the rest of those folks." Well, sir, people stood around thunderstruck, probably wondering if they'd heard right. That day, 5 slaves went free, and a catcher went from hunting slaves to hunting gold, and a whole town learned a thing or two about what matters in this old world of ours. So that's how Freedom Hill got its name. Leastwise, that's the story. As for believing or not believing it, well, reckon you got to decide that one for yourself. And like I said, I really want to believe that this story had some truth in it. And let's see, I got another one here that I think is a pretty incredible story. This one's called Henry's Freedom Box. Now again, this is a true story. This really happened. So it's Henry's Freedom Box by Ellen Levine and Cater Nelson. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthday. Can you imagine that? Not even being allowed to know your own birthday. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Now, some slaves were freed by their owners, and so Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set him free. But the master said, "You're a good worker, Henry. I'm giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family. He looked across the field, and the leaves swirled in the wind. Oh. Henry worked at his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Don't tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy, and he poked the boy with a stick. "If you make a mistake, the boss would beat you." Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. So instead, he hummed all the way home. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little baby, and then another, and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I'm afraid he'll sell our children," she said. Henry sat very still. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No!" cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," and the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco leaves, and his heart twisted in his chest. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves were tied together, and the owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. "Father! Father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? And he saw her the same moment she saw him. And when he wiped away his tears, Nancy too was gone. Here goes his children, and there goes Nancy. Henry was no longer saying. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and just went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were the carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. Many weeks passed. One morning Henry heard singing. A little bird flew out of a tree into the open sky, and Henry thought about being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves," he said. James stared at the box and then at Henry. "Well, what if you cough and someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope," Henry said. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Henry would be delivered to friends in Philadelphia. And then he printed on the crate in big letters, "This side up with care." Henry needed an excuse to stay home or the work boss would think he had run off. James pointed to Henry's sore finger, but Henry knew it wasn't bad enough, so he opened a bottle of oil of vitriol. "No!" cried James, and Henry poured it on his hand, and it burned his skin right to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. So Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand, and they arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. And he had to be desperate to pour that acid on his hand and let it just burn right through the flesh. Ooh. The sun was not up yet when Henry climbed into the box. "Ready," he said. So James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerks to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. Ouch. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. Why, this must be the steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Now think about this. You guys probably have been out on the playground many times, hanging from the monkey bars and stuff, upside down. You know how the blood rushes to your head? After a few minutes, you kind of got to get down out of there. He can't. He's stuck. Blood rushed to his head. His face got hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. "I'm tired of standing," someone said. "Well, why don't we move that box and sit on it?" said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed, and the box scraped the deck. Now he was on his right side, now on his left, and suddenly, right side up. "Hey, what do you think's in here?" said the first man. "Mail, I guess," said the other. "I am mail," thought Henry, but not the kind they imagine. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railroad car, this time head up. He fell asleep to the rattling song of the train wheels. He awoke to loud knocking. "Henry, are you all right in there?" "All right," he answered. The cover was pried open. Henry stretched and he stood up. 4 men smiled at him. "Welcome to Philadelphia." At last, Henry had a birthday. March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. Everyone called him Henry Box Brown. I'm just going to read a little bit here. This is the author's note because that was the end of the story. In the mid-1800s, there were about 4 million slaves living in the United States. Slaves were owned like tables or cows or wagons. Historians believe between 60,000 and 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom. They traveled on what became known as the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, of course, wasn't a real railroad. It was all the secret ways slaves made their way from the south to the north. The fugitives hid in carts, rode on horseback, walked hundreds of miles through forests and swamps, and crossed flowing rivers in summer and icebound rivers in winter. They traveled any way they could to reach freedom. Conductors and station masters hid them and helped them throughout their journey. When Henry Brown climbed into his freedom box, he hoped he'd be carried to a safe world. He brought along a small tool to make air holes, a little water, and a few biscuits. His only worry was about being caught. Henry arrived safely in Philadelphia, having traveled 350 miles from Richmond, Virginia in 27 hours. His story made newspaper headlines in America and Europe, and Henry Box Brown became one of the most famous runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad, the man who mailed himself to freedom. Now, I like that story. That had such a great outcome to it. So now I'm going to switch to just some easy, cool reading. This one's called The Winter Bear. The Winter Bear. And it's by Ruth Kraft and Eric Blegved, if I'm saying that right. This is just a neat story. Let's see. Where's my boot? Where's my sweater? Where's my shoe? Oh, I don't need a hat. Oh, yes, you do. What to do? You'd think it was a shipwreck, but as you know, when you walk in the winter, wherever you go, you must put something on. Just lost part of the page here. So there, the three set off in the cold, still air, with an apple or two and plenty to wear. And one jumped high and one jumped low, and one walked backwards as far as he could go. One gathered together a jaunty bouquet on a bleak winter's day. But look, seeds, dried weeds, briny vine, and old man's beard. These kids are creative, picking weeds and stuff. One counted hungry birds. How many could he see? Birds in winter take what they can find, berries, husks, seeds, and rinds, all the pickings the year leaves behind. One stroked a rough back. How now, brown cow? Even a cow wears a sensible winter coat just now. Three came to a hedge. Two said, "Oh, come on, there's nothing there." But one stopped to stare. Not at the bottom, not at the middle, but at the top. Was that a sock or a shoe or what? Take a stick, quick, carefully, mind. Oh, what a find! A brown knitted bear. Knitted with care, a bit damp, a bit leafy, in need of repair, but still an excellent bear. Hey, two came back. What have you there? Good heavens, a bear? So four ran home. That's three and the bear, crying, "Mom, Mom, here's a bear in the winter with nothing to wear. Oh, he must have something on." Two found some oddments they thought would do. One dried him off with a tissue or two, and together they dressed him and set him with care on a round brown cushion in the best armchair. A warm, friendly place for a cold winter bear. I like how they rescued him there. Anyway, that's just a cute story. I thought you might enjoy it. What have I got? I like this one. It's called I Love Monkey, and it's by S. Kaufman. I Love Monkey. Just a simple story, but so cool. And I love the illustrations in it. Monkey wanted to be something special. Monkey tried to be a bunny, but it was just too floppy. Monkey tried to be an elephant, but it was too wrinkly. Monkey tried to be a squirrel, but it was too nutty. That's a little play on words. I like that. Monkey tried to be a cucumber, but it was way too cool. Monkey tried to be a chicken, but it was quite clucky. Monkey tried to be sushi, but it was too tasty. Ooh. Monkey tried to be a robot, but it was too squeaky. Oh, that's a big picture there. Oh, I gotta hold it way up. Monkey tried to be a monster, but that was just too scary. Ah. Monkey tried to be a penguin, but it was just too frosty. Monkey tried to be a bee, but it was too bumbly. Monkey tried to be a night owl, but it was too sleepy. Oh, poor monkey. Monkey tried to be a vegetable, but it was too corny. Monkey tried to be the solar system, but it was just too vast. Then one day, Monkey had a wonderful thought. Maybe I can't be a bunny or an elephant or a squirrel, but there's one very special thing that I can be. I can be myself. No one in the entire world could ever do a better job of being me than me. And that makes me special. That makes me a snuggable, lovable, one-of-a-kind monkey. And I think that goes for all of us. Nobody can do a better job of being me, or you than you. And that's the end of the story. And I like how they put F-I-N, fin, instead of the end. Which makes me think this came from Europe, that story. I got one real quick one. It's just a goofy one. And I'm going to read this, and this will be the last story for now. It's called Yo, Yes, by Chris Rushka. Chris Rushka. Yo, yes. So here we got these two kids, these two boys there. Yo! Yes? Hey! Who? You! Me? Yes, you. Oh. What's up? Not much. Why? No fun. Oh? No friends. No friends. Oh, yes. Look! Me! You? Yes, me. You? Well? Question mark there. And he says, yes! Yo! Yes! Wow! That cool? Just a simple little book like that has such a message to it. Okay, guys, I think I'm going to call that good for right now. I'm going to try to get back either later today or possibly tomorrow morning and see if we can get a few more knocked out. So in the meantime, don't forget, wash your hands, wear your mask, social distance, and know we are going to get through this, and we will all soon be back in school. Maybe not this school year, I don't know. But by next school year, I'm going to be back in those buildings reading again. I guarantee you. In the meantime, adios, amigos. See you later.